Abdullah al-Arian is an assistant professor of history at Georgetown University here in Qatar. Welcome to Al Jazeera. What is the value of this election? Is it merely to serve as another poll confirming a new leader, or is it to show that democracy is alive and well in Egypt?
Well, I think that there's certainly an attempt to try to show that there's a democratic process, but certainly that's not at all the evidence that we've had over the last year has been one of increasing authoritarian behavior on the part of the regime, and this is meant to cement the authority of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as the new uncontested ruler of Egypt. And I think we've seen it based on his campaign rhetoric, based on the indiscriminate use of violence that he's used against any and all opposition and protesters, the campaign of fear that's been waged against the Egyptian population. And I think as we look at these results and we see that there's an attempt as much as possible to cement this image of an uncontested ruler, someone who's unanimously been approved, it's quite obvious that this is meant really as a coronation rather than as an actual legitimate election.
How important is the size of al-Sisi's majority, because let's cut to the chase here, and also the size of the turnout?
Well, I think the fact that there's more discussion of the turnout than of the actual results signals a couple of things. First, it tells us that I think that this is no longer really seen as a legitimate contest, that we know that this is, of course, that the chips are completely stacked in favor of Sisi's candidacy because it has the full mobilization of the authoritarian state behind it. But the fact that the turnout has been so low is also quite alarming because it shows that there are millions of Egyptians who refuse to take part in this process, whether as part of an active boycott in which they're, of course, not accepting the legitimacy of his presidency, or even if it is political apathy, which of course we know also exists, but because people still feel disenfranchised from this process and don't feel like they're a part of any kind of democratic transition.
So what you're saying is if it's a very low turnout, people who don't want to vote, possibly for al-Sisi, won't in fact vote for the opposition, they'll just stay away.
Right, because there's no sense that the opposition has any actual possibility or opportunity to win this election. And so I think that what we've seen is a rejection of the increasing authoritarian behavior of this regime, frustration with the fact that on the two things that he's hoped to run his entire campaign on, the idea of return to economic prosperity and bringing security to the country and stability, that he's failed miserably in the year that he's already had, that this is not simply an election after the overthrow of the Morsi presidency, but in fact he's already had 1 year to prove himself and has of course failed to do so.
Earlier in the year, 98% of Egyptians voted for a new constitution. Will it be up to the new leader to write that new constitution, or will the priority be to rescue a decrepit economy?
Well, I think that the constitution that's currently in place is the one that, of course, is being used to try to legitimize this presidency and the incoming government of Sisi. And so, of course, his biggest priorities will be economic in nature, but of course he's relied so much on foreign aid that there's very little in terms of an economic plan for rescue recovery beyond the kind of usual politics and usual economic policies that we've seen that were marked in the Mubarak years in terms of the patronage networks and the kinds of privileges that were enjoyed by the military and the extended state.
This is anything between the 7th and the 10th time Egyptians have been to the polls in recent years. Are Egyptians still firmly behind the process of a poll, of an election, do you think? Do they still believe in it? Its validity, rather?
Well, I think that the circumstances under which this particular election is happening is very, very different than the ones that we saw in 2011, 2012. Those were much more as part of a revolutionary process, a transition. Even if it was not a complete revolution, it was one in which at least it ushered in the opportunity for people to express their political preferences. We haven't seen that being possible. When we go back actually to that constitutional referendum that happened in January, anyone who voted against it was actually arrested, or who protested against it was of course subject to arrest or harassment within Egyptian society or by the regime. And so we don't see that opportunity to actually express one's choices freely exists in this current climate in Egypt. And so as a result, no one, I think, sees this as anything but the same kinds of politics as usual election that we saw mark the Mubarak years going back several decades.
Abdullah al-Arian, thanks for joining us.